Hello, Matthew Bell with Alzheimer'sProof.com, and today I want to start a series on safety devices in the home. And I'm going to start with 3 or 4 of the most relevant to fire safety and smoke inhalation, carbon monoxide inhalation, and these kinds of things. Now, much of this information is going to be widely available in other formats, but what I don't really see a lot of is a kind of a combination of some of the unique challenges that are posed by people who have Alzheimer's, dementia, other forms of cognitive impairment, along with these risks. But let's just kind of dive into it, and hopefully some of these concerns will get unpacked as we move along. So the first device obviously is going to be a smoke detector. This is going to be a vital sensor to have in the house because of the fact that smoke inhalation is the #1 cause of death in home fire situations. So people might think fire is going to burn you to death, but in many cases it's smoke inhalation that actually kills people. So the smoke detector gives the person an advanced warning that something is happening, hopefully advanced warning. In our case, I tried to pepper the house with smoke detectors, so I have a number of smoke detectors throughout the house. You want them to be in or near bedrooms, in or near places where fire might be more likely to originate. So for example, in a kitchen, I have one in the garage, maybe one near your fireplace. If you have space heaters or other kinds of equipment that are routinely operated in a particular area, you might consider putting a smoke detector in that area as well. Now, smoke rises, and so the typical advice is going to be to place the smoke detectors up high, either on a ceiling or high up on a wall. You want to check the batteries of the smoke detector, test to make sure that it is operating correctly. There's a little button on most of them that obviously runs it through a test cycle. But in this regard, there are a few challenges that come up, in particular with a person who has Alzheimer's or some other form of dementia. So first of all, a person with Alzheimer's and dementia cannot be counted on to properly install a smoke detector. So you can't simply leave it to them to make sure that they have a smoke detector that's installed. Secondly, they can't be counted on to properly maintain the smoke detector. There is going to be the need to change batteries. If it's a battery-operated detector, the need to check it or have a battery backup that's functional. If it is a plug-in variety, an AC smoke detector, and they're not going to be counted on to be able to do that. Now, in addition to that, they can also not be counted on not to either advertently or inadvertently disable or defeat the smoke detector. So this can happen a number of different ways. Obviously, you can turn your attention from a relative. Maybe they get into the kitchen, start cooking, they end up with a smoky mess. The smoke detector goes off and they remove it because they don't want to listen to it beeping. I actually observed this occur when my dad put a plastic spoon into the dishwasher. I don't know if I doubt he intentionally laid it on the bottom of the dishwasher, but the result of this, however it happened, the spoon may have slipped through, or fork or whatever it was, may have slipped through, but the end result was that it was resting on the heating element. And so this plastic fork essentially started to burn from the heating element in the dishwasher, which was designed obviously to dry the dishes after they went through the wash cycle. This kicked off smoke. It actually also kicked off carbon monoxide, which we'll get to in just a minute. But it kicked off smoke, and my dad's first impulse was to try to disable the smoke detector because he just didn't want to listen to the beeping sound. So you can't rely on a person with cognitive impairment to not do something like that, whether it's because it's going off and they're annoyed by it, or whether it's because they need the outlet, or because they see this thing on the wall and they can't remember why it was there and they just take it off. So there's any number of things that can go wrong, and it's very difficult to predict sometimes what a person with a cognitive impairment will do. But they can't be counted on to install it, to maintain it, and even not to defeat it once you've installed it and maintained it. But finally, because a person with dementia obviously has cognitive impairment, their judgment is diminished, their ability to remember is obviously impacted, they can't be counted on to remember what to do in the event that it does go off. So we already talked about people who might be inclined to try to disable it if it goes off. Even if that's not their first impulse, they can't be counted on to know they need to go outside and seek fresh air, they need to call 911. They can't be counted on to go through the normal steps that you or I might go through if we were faced with a situation that was an obvious potential emergency. Now, all of this is to say that this just raises the necessity to have proper oversight of your loved one, because the person who's the caretaker is going to have to be responsible for going in making sure there are operable smoke detectors, even more than simply routine testing. You're going to have to make it almost a weekly thing to make sure that something hasn't been disabled, particularly if they're within reach. So maybe a smoke detector that's mounted up high is not going to be something that I would have had to check every week because my dad was unlikely, since I had restricted access to the step ladder and I knew where the chairs were, so if you tried to move a chair and get up. So the point is, the more accessible some of these things are, the more you might have to check them for functionality. So it might not be an issue with smoke detectors. Maybe it will be an issue with a carbon monoxide detector or some other sensor. Now, in general, in a fire prevention situation, you want to obviously make sure that you have an evacuation plan, an escape plan if necessary. You want to make sure you involve the neighbors if that's possible, because you do have a cognitively impaired loved one. Your neighbors can be a valuable resource. And we're assuming here that the loved one is at least semi-independent. This may or may not be the case for you. Depending on the stage the person's at, they may require round-the-clock care. And if they're in the home, presumably the caretaker is going to be there, or some respite caretaker is going to be there, or some nurse is going to be there with them at all times. They can't be left alone, obviously, if they are severely cognitively impaired. However, if they're still in early stages and perhaps they're still living by themselves, in that case, you're going to have a more thought out plan. You're going to have to involve other people. You're going to have to check on them routinely. And an option that's actually attractive to some people, if you have the funds for it, is to get a smoke detection system that's actually wired into some kind of a monitored service. So it might be part of your alarm system if you have a monitored alarm system. But there are companies that will monitor the alarm that is on the smoke detector. And if the alarm goes off, they will contact the fire department without your loved one having to understand what's happening or make the call him or herself. Now, in addition to having the smoke detector, obviously part of the conversation about fire prevention is going to be to try to restrict things in the home that may be likely to generate a fire. If your loved one is a smoker, then it's going to have to be even more carefully thought through in terms of how to plan that or how to monitor their activity, because as their dementia progresses, they're probably going to get more and more careless, or less and less careful, as it were. Another thing would be operating things like space heaters, operating fireplaces, and these kinds of things. It would probably be well to secure them. In another video, I talk about how there's a little stop power plug lock that can fit on the end of electrical cords. That's very good for space heaters and the like of that might be left on inadvertently. There are ways of sealing off a fireplace, kind of locking it up. In addition to that, some people speak about oven locks or oven timers, or ovens that have a feature for self-cooling themselves if they have been on for a period of time. So there are a number of things that you might be able to incorporate depending on your budget and depending on the actual needs of the circumstance. My own feeling is that you probably don't want to rely on a self-timed oven. You probably, if your loved one's gotten to that point, you're going to need to simply find some way for them to have the kind of supervision that they need on a daily basis. But again, every situation is going to be different, and for some people that might be an attractive option. Now, related to that is going to be the carbon monoxide risk. Now, carbon monoxide really poses at least a threefold risk. The first thing is that you can't smell it. It has no odor. It doesn't smell like natural gas, for example, has chemicals that are added to it that enable it to be more easily detected. But this is not the case with carbon monoxide. It's often called the silent killer for that reason. You can have it in the house in quantities that are significant enough to kill a person, and yet you would have no perception of that, at least through your normal sense of smell, through the olfactory senses. Now, a second reason that carbon monoxide is so dangerous is because it can actually penetrate different wall spaces. So it can actually go, let's say, from a garage into the main part of the house if all that's there is drywall. Because of the size of the CO molecule, it can actually pass through certain building materials, and that presents an elevated risk. And number three, in addition to those things, it mixes very well with air, which means that it can be evenly distributed in a house space. It doesn't drop, it doesn't sink, it doesn't rise particularly. Now, there are caveats there. It depends on the temperature of the air, depends on the temperature of the CO. So if the CO is generated through some incomplete combustion, that air might be warmer and it might rise. There are certain temperature and pressure situations, I'm sure, that can cause that to vary. Once again, personally, I have a number of CO detectors the carbon monoxide detector was one of the ones that went off in the case that I mentioned to you previously, where my dad had inadvertently allowed a fork or spoon to drop into the heating element of the dishwasher. And we have subsequently also discovered that CO monitors typically have thresholds where they kick in. So for instance, in some cases the threshold might be 40 parts per million, 50 parts per million, 60 parts per million, which is quite a lot. You can actually get a low-level carbon monoxide detector that can detect down to 5, 10, or lower parts per million in terms of CO content. The detectors that are available that are not low detectors still are probably able to detect a situation that's literally deadly serious. So certain levels of CO are going to present an immediate threat to life. But low levels of CO can also cause chronic conditions to develop. And so in our house, we decided to obtain one low-level CO detector. Now, regular CO detectors might run you $50. A low-level CO detector might run you $200. So they are more expensive, but it may be worth it because the low-level CO detector could detect, as it sounds like, a very low level of CO that the higher detector wouldn't be sensitive enough to pick up. And that low level may not be a lethal threat, or it may not be the case that that amount of CO could kill you immediately. It still might be the case that that could cause some kind of health concern or illness. Now, as far as I know, with CO detectors, it doesn't matter as much. Like smoke rises, the CO, as I said, tends to mix fairly well, so you might actually kind of just vary the height of these. You would want one at least on the lower level, one on the main level. And if you're like me, I'm somewhat paranoid in this regard. I have about 5 of them sprinkled throughout the house in various places, and that's including the low-level CO monitor, which in our case is mounted to the wall, and I'll put a picture up on the screen here. Our family actually opted to get a explosive gas detector or a natural gas detector. In the laundry area, we had a dryer and a water heater that were both gas powered. And so my dad would use the gas piping to hang hangers on and other things, I guess. And apparently what had happened is he loosened one of these pipes. Now, this presented a situation where there was a low level of natural gas present in the laundry area. It was noticeable, but the thing about natural gas sometimes is that your nose, I guess, I'm not an expert on this, but your nose seems to get used to it. And so it's one of those things where I'm not sure, do I smell it, do I not smell it? So finally we had somebody come out and they detected it, and it was detectable in their little instruments, and they found the leak, from the gas company, and they were able to fix it. But what it clued me into was the fact that there's another danger here that I didn't consider, because your smoke detector and your CO detector are not necessarily going to go off just because there's a natural gas leak. It's a completely different chemical. And so we went ahead and invested in a natural gas detector. Now, the main risk with natural gas is going to be the risk of explosion. You should bear in mind with explosive gas and explosive vapors that there are what are called upper and lower limits to how much gas vapor can be explosive. So in the case of natural gas, I believe that the lower limit is 5% and the upper limit is 15%. Now what that means, in fact, is that if the natural gas, like for example, if you had a tank filled with natural gas, inside the tank the mixture is too rich in terms of natural gas to actually explode. Now, if you had also such a low level as we ended up having, in fact, it was such a low level in the laundry area that it was below 5%, meaning it wasn't an immediate danger of explosion. But the problem with having it on the low side is that if the leak continues, then the gas can build up to an explosive amount. So between that 5 and 15% window, that's where the real danger is. I'm not aware if natural gas can actually sicken you just by breathing it in. I would expect it's probably not going to be good for you, but I'm not sure that it actually is fatal just breathing it. Again, the real concern is that the slightest spark or some kind of a match being lit or a static charge might be enough to detonate it or set it off in the event that it did reach these explosive limits. So for us, the natural gas detector was very helpful. In further installments, I'll get into additional safety devices. I may also get into the installation of some of these if anybody is interested in that part of it. But if you did find something of use in this video, I invite you to like it, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell to be alerted to new content as it becomes available. I thank you so much for joining me today. I look forward to seeing you again in another video, and I hope you are safe in your environment with your loved one.